Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd. Today we're going to talk a bit about vultures. How's everyone doing today? Here in California, it's sunny, a bit breezy, and still a bit cool, but it's a beautiful day. Happy to be here. With vultures, there are 23 species of vultures. If that may sound like a lot, that may sound like a little, but they are a very dynamic and interesting group of birds. 14 of the species of vultures are listed as either threatened or endangered, which is a really high percentage. That's well over half. And we'll talk about that a bit at the end. Scientists split vultures into two groups. And there's old world vultures. Those are the vultures that live in Europe, Africa, and Asia. And there's new world vultures. And those are the vultures that live here in the Americas, North and South America. There's some similarities between them, but there are definitely some differences between the two groups. And they have quite a few differences because they're not actually closely related. And that's something that science calls convergent evolution. That's kind of a big term, but that basically means that different animals evolved along different paths to fulfill the same niche or same role in their environment. And so they have a lot of similar looking characteristics, although they're not closely related. Vultures are a really good example of convergent evolution. And part of those differences are because of who they're related to. So old world vultures, those are again the Europe, Africa, and Asia vultures, they are closely related to raptors, things like hawks, falcons, and eagles. And the new world vultures, they're actually closer related to things like storks and herons, which is a bit interesting, but they have some differences that more closely align with who they're related to. One of which is that the New World vultures, several of the species have amazing sense of smell. Now, I don't know if it's scientifically proven, but I've heard it said that the turkey vulture has one of the best senses of smell on the planet. And that's kind of a tough thing to actually measure or compare, but they do know that the amount of a brain of the turkey vulture that's dedicated to receiving olfactory or smell sense notifications is very large, and that usually means it's very important to that type of animal. Now, we've talked about some other animals with great senses of smells, things like bears, things like some of the cats. So it's kind of tough to compare species to species, but New World vultures in general have a strong sense of smell, with the turkey vulture being one of those that has the best sense of smell. You can find turkey vultures throughout the US. They're quite common here in Los Angeles. I see them almost every day. They fly over my neighborhood, sometimes right over our house, so I see them close by quite often. Now, to contrast that, the old world vultures, the ones in Europe, Africa, and Asia, they have a really strong sense of vision. They can see amazing far distances. I read something that said that a vulture can spot a 3-foot carcass, so about this big, from multiple miles away. And that would be if the vulture's really high in the air, it'd be able to find where something is dead down on the ground. And they use more their sense of vision to find their food. Now, in both species, they will also rely kind of on each other. They know that there's different types of vultures in their area, and if they see a group of vultures circling, that is usually a sign to the others that there is something good to eat nearby. Now, good to eat is in vulture terms. Most of us would never eat anything that a vulture would eat, but vultures play a very specific role in their environment, and that is they are nature's cleanup crew. To do that, they have a couple of really unique features that kind of allow them to do things that most animals can't do. Because see, vultures eat dead animals. They don't kill things themselves. It's very rare that they would go after anything alive, only if it's hurt or injured already, or sometimes there's a type of vulture that will eat ostrich eggs called an Egyptian vulture. They actually take rocks up into the air and drop the rocks on the nest, to break open the eggs, but that's a whole different story. But vultures eat carrion, or dead animals. And by doing that, they have usually a bald head or very few feathers on their head. And that's to just make sure that their heads stay nice and clean, even though their heads go inside the dead animal quite often to eat. They don't want all that gook from the dead animal getting caught in their feathers. So they have a bald head. That's easily for them to clean up later after they're done eating. Vultures also are really good at gliding. They can typically soar for hours on end with very few wing flaps, and that helps them to save energy as they search their environment looking for dead things to eat. Now, as nature's cleanup crew, they eat some pretty nasty stuff, or what to us would be pretty nasty stuff. And they have very acidic stomachs, and the acids in a vulture's stomach are capable of destroying a lot of very harmful bacteria and diseases. Things like anthrax, botulism, and cholera, and other harmful bacteria. And that's pretty amazing, but that's also very important to us and to other animals in their environment. Those diseases can be deadly to people, and if those diseases get out of control, it can cause a lot of problem for the entire habitat or ecosystem. And when we have vultures in place doing their job, it helps eliminate a lot of those diseases. And so they're very important to their environment. Vultures are generally similar sizes and shapes. So the smallest vultures are kind of still larger sized birds, probably about like this big, weighing maybe 10 or 12 pounds. The big guys get up to in their 45-pound range. Those would be the condors, and a couple species of vulture in Europe and Africa get really huge. Now, those big guys, they perform a special role. The bigger the vulture, typically the sharper its beak and its ability to rip through the tough hide of an animal. So some of the smaller vultures, particularly say in Africa where there's a lot of animals around and sometimes a lot of dead animals, maybe the little guys, the little vultures, find it first, but they have a smaller beak and it's not quite as easy to open up the carcass. So they have to kind of wait for one of the bigger species to show up to rip open that carcass. One of my favorite vultures that does that in Africa is called a lappet-faced vulture. And when I worked at the Phoenix Zoo, we had a pair of lappet-faced vultures, and they were absolutely huge. Really cool to look at. Really amazing vultures, but they have really strong, big beaks, and they would be able to rip open the hide of a dead animal. Now, beyond that, there's some kind of medium-sized vultures that have really long necks. And those vultures are really good about going inside the carcass and pulling things out. And then there's some vultures that maybe have the faster wings and the better eyesight and littler beaks, but they are good at cleaning up all those little scraps at the end. Together in Africa, there's, I believe, 11 species of vultures, and they all kind of work together performing different roles. Now here in the Americas, there's only 7 species of vultures between North America and South America. In North America, we have something called a black vulture. That's usually more in the eastern United States, from say like Texas over east towards like Florida. And we also have the turkey vulture, which can be found throughout the US, but is pretty prominent in the western US. In addition to those two, which are both kind of on the smaller end side, we have one of the biggest vultures, which is actually called a condor, the California condor. And they are absolutely enormous, with a wingspan of almost 10 feet from tip to tip. That's an enormous bird. We'll talk a little bit more about them. But in those environments, different species would play different roles. And that happens in South America as well as like what I described in Africa. And one of the bigger vultures in South America is called a king vulture. And he's called that because he's very beautiful and very impressive looking, but he also has a very sharp beak that can open up the carcass. And then of course there's a condor down in South America too, called the Andean condor. And I believe that is the largest of all vulture species. I know it's bigger than our California condor. Really amazing birds, the Andean condors. Really huge. I believe their wings can be nearly 11 feet from tip to tip. Vultures also hold some unique places in world history. For instance, there's a species of vulture that lives in Africa called a Ruppel's griffin vulture. They're one of those with a really long neck. They're they're a large vulture, but not a huge vulture. But they hold the world record for being the highest flying bird. And that was set by an individual bird in 1973 when it collided with an airplane who was flying over Africa. And that airplane was up at 37,000 feet. For a bird to be up that high is really remarkable. But the vultures can definitely go very high. They're very good at soaring and gliding. They ride the hot air currents up, and that takes them high into the sky to where they can have a bigger range of vision to see down below them to find their food. One thing that I think is very fascinating about vultures is they have a unique defense strategy. If they're eating and they're busy eating and something bigger comes along, say they're in Africa and they're eating a dead antelope that maybe the lions had already left, but say the vultures are busy eating on that and a hyena comes up and tries to chase them away. If the vultures have eaten a lot of food, they can eat up to 20% of their body weight in a single sitting. That vulture might be too heavy to fly away. So what it will do is it will vomit up the food that's in its stomach, and that lightens its load so it can take off. And that also, if it's recently eaten food, it might be something that the other animal coming in might want. Like that hyena might stop and say, "Oh, there's all this good food right here that the vulture just left for me." Or if it's been inside the vulture a while and is starting to get a little stinky with some of those acids, it might smell so strong that the hyena is like, "Hey, I'm out of here." And then the vulture can come back and finish eating. So it's kind of a unique defense strategy that they have, that they can vomit up their meal. Vultures, especially in the New World, will also do a very unique sort of thing of cooling their bodies down. It can get pretty hot. And so they will actually pee or poop on their legs to help cool them down. And so sometimes if you see a vulture and it has very white, scaly looking legs, that's because they've been peeing or pooping on their legs to help cool them down. It's kind of interesting, not something I would recommend, but interesting to learn about. Now, we've mentioned earlier that vultures are very threatened. 14 species of the 23 species are threatened with, are listed as threatened or endangered. And again, surprise, surprise, those are because of things that humans have screwed up. The biggest threat to vultures is poisoning. And there's poisoning happening in a variety of different ways. Some of it is intentional, meaning people are trying to poison vultures. And some of it is just, it happens because people are careless with chemicals or other things. So we're going to talk about a few of those different things and the problems that they cause. One of those is that if people are growing crops and they're trying to make those plants, the crops that they're growing, healthy, they may be trying to poison weeds, or they may be trying to poison rodents or other little animals that might try to eat their crops. And both those things, herbicides killing plants or pesticides killing other animals, can cause big problems for vultures. Those things can get into the food chain, and then that can have a lasting effect on a vulture and poison the vulture. There's also a big problem. This is a problem in the US with vultures, particularly with the California condor. If you're a hunter and if you use bullets to go hunting, if those bullets are lead, that creates a big problem. Lead bullets, when they are shot through a gun, sometimes fragment into little tiny pieces. And then as the vulture's eating maybe the guts of the deer that you shot and you left your gut pile there, if you didn't take the bullet pieces with you, the vulture could ingest or eat those pieces of lead bullets, and then that bullet part gets stuck in the vulture and slowly dissolves in those strong acids, but then it causes the vulture to have something called lead poisoning. And that's a huge problem with California condors. It's actually the biggest problem they still face today, is hunting with lead bullets and lead bullets poisoning the vultures. Now, lead bullets in some states in the United States are actually illegal, or there's a voluntary ban on them. If you are a hunter or know someone who's a hunter, I would highly recommend that you encourage them to use non-lead bullets. It's safer for our environment, and much safer for vultures, who again are important scavengers in our environment to help get rid of some of those harmful diseases that could exist. Now, there's another type of poisoning that's been causing big problems for vultures, and that's with some medications that are given to animals, particularly in portions of Asia, where people may have a cow that they use to help plow a field. If that cow gets a sore leg, they may give that cow some medicine, and maybe that cow eventually dies. All the medicine has built up in that cow over time, and especially if the owner of the cow is like, oh, my cow's not doing well, I should give it more medicine and more medicine and more medicine. When the cow does die and a vulture eats the dead cow, if that medicine's in the cow's system, it can poison the vultures really well. And that caused a huge problem in vultures in Asia. There's a specific drug that has been used called dioflanactin. You don't need to remember that, it's a big word. But that drug has caused a lot of problems with vultures, to the point that in about a 10 to 15 year span, 90% of the vultures in Asia have disappeared. And they were poisoned mostly because of that drug being used to treat injured or sick livestock. And that's pretty sad. Luckily, some of those countries have started to ban that drug. Unfortunately, with a lot of laws, they're not regularly enforced, or there's still black market available where the drug is still being used. But that has caused a big problem for vultures. Now, another big threat to vultures is actually in our shot today, right up here behind me, power lines. Power lines can cause big problems for vultures. Usually the ones in neighborhoods like above me are not a problem. Those are usually insulated and aren't gonna hurt anybody. But some of the big power lines that run out in forest areas or open land spaces can cause a huge problem, especially for larger birds. If a bird is able to touch two wires at the same time, maybe on this wingtip and this wingtip, which is easy to do for a big vulture. They sometimes, almost all of them have at least 6 foot wingspans. So if they touch two wires at the same time, they get electrocuted. And that's a big problem for a lot of vultures worldwide. Here in the US, not as much, but it is a problem still. And so power companies could be a little more responsible in insulating their lines, or making sure that they're more visible or further apart so that they don't electrocute vultures. The third big threat to vultures is vehicle collisions. So as you're driving along, you may have seen a dead animal on the side of the road, something like a rabbit or a deer, bigger things, smaller things. Vultures love to eat dead animals, and so they are sometimes on the road and eating something when cars drive by. So if you see something in the road ahead, slow down. Don't hit it. There may be live animals there. Try not to hit them with your car. Go a little slower if you're driving around a bend or in a mountainous area or a place where they say there's a deer crossing. All of those things can help limit the number of vulture vehicle collisions. Now, I want to talk a little bit about a very special vulture species called the California condor. It's a huge bird. It is an icon of the American West. Lewis and Clark, the famous explorers, saw California condors on their trek west back in the 1800s when they followed the Columbia River to its mouth at the Pacific Ocean. They saw mighty birds that they didn't know how to describe them because nobody had ever really documented them before. And they learned from the local native peoples that those birds were called thunderbirds because they make such loud noise with their giant wings that flap. Now, over the next couple hundred years since Lewis and Clark's time, California condors got drastically wiped out. Again, a lot of that was because of lead poisoning from hunters' bullets. There were other problems too. Some of the big fires in California have caused a lot of problems in their nesting grounds. People thought that California condors were pests. People thought that they were hunting animals that they might want to hunt, so they would sometimes shoot them. But by 1983, there were only 22 California condors left. And that was a really low number. People who had been studying them knew that that would not end well unless something drastic was done. And so the U.S. Department of Wildlife, Fish and Game, and a couple of zoos, specifically the Los Angeles Zoo and the San Diego Zoo Safari Park, teamed up to do something pretty bold. And they caught all the California condors that were flying out there in the wild. They caught 22 of them. They brought them to those two zoos, and they started a breeding program. And it took them a couple of years to figure out how to best take care of those birds to where they could have eggs and have babies successfully. But the program has been very successful. Now, some of those birds are still with us in the breeding program today, which is pretty remarkable, but vultures and birds of that size typically can live a very long time. They can definitely live into their 50s and 60s, and some of those original founders of that breeding program, called a species survival plan, are still breeding in those facilities today. Now, in my work with zoos, I've been able to see California condors. I've been able to see some of the breeding facilities, and I've definitely seen Santa Barbara Zoo and San Diego Zoo and the San Diego Safari Park all actually have California condors on public display now. And since then, they've also been joined by the Phoenix Zoo, who I used to work for, who also now has California condors on display. Also, the Los Angeles Zoo has a California condor that they can bring out for special events that will sit on somebody's glove, and they also have one that will fly in their bird show. So all of those places are really remarkable spots to see California condors. Those zoos that I mentioned early on, though, the San Diego Zoo Safari Park and the Los Angeles Zoo, they also teamed up with an organization called the Peregrine Fund. And that's our special shout out today. The Peregrine Fund has done a lot to help endangered birds, specifically raptors, things like hawks, eagles, falcons, and the California condor. I'll put up some videos of some of the birds they have released. So as the breeding program has taken off, they've been able to release some of those babies back into the wild. So now there are over 400 wild California condors, and there's still about another 100 of them in the breeding program in zoos and a few other spots. Now, I mentioned earlier that lead poisoning is a big problem with California condors. When I was at the Phoenix Zoo, one of our veterinarians there kept getting calls from the Grand Canyon, the national park, because they were finding sick and injured birds. And that veterinarian did a really great job of identifying how to do a field test. So they could test the bird in the wild. When they caught the sick bird, they could test it to find out if lead poisoning was a problem. And with that great research that she was able to do, her name's Dr. Kathy Orr, salute to her, they were able to figure out how to save many of the California condors. And that field test is still being used in California, Arizona, Utah, and sometimes in Mexico when they find an injured bird down there. But thanks to that field test, they're able to figure out if lead poisoning is a problem. Then they can bring that bird into a zoo setting or to the Peregrine Fund at their facility in Idaho, and they're able to treat that bird, and they have to kind of put it on similar to like kidney dialysis to help flush the poisons out of its body. Sometimes they don't make it, sometimes they do. But really amazing work done by zoo veterinarians to help out wild populations of condors. And definitely with the species survival plan, that is one of the big success stories of animal conservation that has happened in recent times. They're still breeding California condors in zoos and at the Peregrine Fund, and they've done a really remarkable job at doing so. Now, I mentioned that there's California condors in the wild today. There's two different release locations in California. One of them is about 50 miles from me here in North Los Angeles, up in Ventura County. I have not seen a condor in that space. I hope to someday do so. I have seen some photos of condors taken from that area, but it is very remote, even though it's really close to Los Angeles, and I hope to be able to see them. I have seen a California condor near the Grand Canyon, and let me just tell you, it is an amazing sight. The one I saw was on top of a power pole, sitting with a bunch of other birds, but it dwarfed them in size comparison. It was like 3 times bigger than the other ravens and the turkey vultures that were sitting around it. So it was really impressive. It didn't fly. It was kind of a dreary, rainy morning, and it was just hunkered down, waiting out the storm with the other birds. But really amazing birds to see. At the Santa Barbara Zoo was the first time I saw California condors up close. A really cool exhibit there. You can see them fly. It's amazing to hear them as their wings beat. Really cool. I see I have a question about how can you tell if it's a girl or a boy? That's a really good question. With most birds, it's pretty tricky. Some birds have different colors depending on males or females. Think of like a mallard duck. That's really easy to tell apart. Most birds, it's really tricky. Most vultures, it's next to impossible to tell just by looking at them. One big exception to that is an Andean condor. Andean condors have very different looking heads. The males have a very special little wiggly bit that's just above their beak called a carnacle. So Andean condors, you can tell really easily if it's a boy or a girl. Most other vultures, you cannot. How many eggs do they lay at one time? Typically one. Yeah, one a year. That's why if vultures become threatened or endangered, it's very slow for their populations to rebound. In the breeding program, they figured out if they took an egg away, the parents will often lay a second egg. And so they can either then put that first egg in an incubator, or sometimes they'll give it to another pair of vultures who didn't lay an egg that year, and they'll incubate it. But typically they will only take care of one egg. Occasionally they will do something called double brooding, where they will have two eggs, but it's pretty rare. So that concludes most of what I have to share about vultures today. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've had some fun, and I hope you enjoy. I'll be putting up some videos and photos of vultures on the Facebook, so check those out later today. Some really amazing animals. I'm really happy that I've had a chance to work around vultures and to see some of them in the wild, and definitely learn more about them. So until tomorrow, enjoy, take care of yourself, stay safe, have fun. Thanks.